Chapter 5. Ginny, it's ludicrous and unnecessary. Wearing gray sweats and a black wool sweater, Emma paced the hardwood floor of her loft as she clutched her phone to her ear. You're telling me he's only 19, which means this is probably just a kid with a crush. I don't need a high-powered security expert like Aiden Wallace to fix this. I've lost control of the situation, Ginny said. Howard Wallace has convinced Roger that Aiden needs to go. Because of Howard and Roger's long friendship, Wallace Enterprises is cutting Aiden's usual fee in half, and you know Roger can't pass up a bargain. Ginny, Emma sighed in frustration. How am I supposed to explain him to the bookstore folks? Won't they freak out if they think I'm in enough danger to need a bodyguard? Which I'm not, but having Mr. Muscles there will make it seem as if I could be kidnapped at any moment. Mr. Muscles. Ginny laughed. That's good. Anyway, no worries about the explanation. I've canceled your media escort for Chicago. Aiden has your itinerary and he'll become your escort for the Chicago gig. It's only 2 days, Em. You'll make my life a lot easier if you'll go along with this. But what about my life? Emma couldn't imagine how she'd make it through 2 solid days with Aiden in tow. Last night had been embarrassing enough. She'd kissed him for Christ's sake. She'd based that impulse on her firm belief that she wouldn't see him until the next book signing, and by then she'd have a sexy boyfriend to call her own, somebody who would stack up very well against Aiden Wallace, poster boy for Bowflex. Please, Em, Ginny said. Howard's put the fear of God into Roger and he's acting like a mother hen over here. Next thing you know he'll decide to go along and monitor your Chicago appearances. Emma closed her eyes in resignation. Okay. So she'd have to be humiliated. She could only imagine what Aiden thought about this, being told to keep a grown woman safe from a love-struck teenager. Damn, she'd made such a fool of herself last night, too. She'd practically begged him to come upstairs with her, and he'd turned her down twice. But had she attempted to retain her dignity in the face of his double rejection? No. She'd planted one on him, just so he'd know for sure that she craved his body. How could she face him at JFK on Friday morning? She only had one option, to play the cool professional who considered this whole exercise ridiculous. She did think it was ridiculous, but playing the cool professional in the presence of his hot body would take some doing. Aiden arrived at the gate early on Friday morning. He hadn't seen Emma in the line going through security, and she wasn't in the gate area either. He hoped to hell she wouldn't show up at the last minute, or worse yet, miss the plane. She had a tendency to run late, something he knew from those months of watching her. He bought coffee and sipped it as he paced the gate area and cast frequent glances down the concourse. Nothing. He should have followed his first impulse and insisted on picking her up in the town car to guarantee she'd be on time. They'd exchanged a couple of brief emails in which he'd suggested exactly that, and she'd refused the offer. Not surprising considering the way he'd rejected her invitation on Wednesday night. She'd want to keep her distance. And that was all to the good, especially considering the plan he'd devised to make sure Theo backed off. Posing as her media escort wouldn't be enough. Aiden had decided to present himself as her fiancé, but he had to make sure the masquerade didn't tempt him to get too chummy with her. If she remained aloof, that would help. When the gate attendant announced boarding for first-class passengers, he pulled out his phone and called her. No answer. Damn it, this was not a good way to start out. He caught her scent before he saw her, but then there she was striding toward the gate in 3-inch black heels and pulling a wheeled computer case. Her blonde hair bounced around her shoulders and her black trench coat was unbuttoned. It flapped back to reveal a turquoise suit that hugged her curves in a way that made his mouth go dry. She wore a white lace camisole under the jacket, and the shadow of her cleavage was visible through the delicate lace. This would be a very long 2 days. They're calling for us to board, he said as she approached. In the 36 hours they'd been apart, he'd kidded himself that he'd overreacted to her on Wednesday night. Wrong. You switched me to first class. Her blue eyes flashed with indignation. I've been down at the ticket counter trying to change back to coach, but they'd already sold my original seat. She smelled absolutely wonderful. Ginny didn't tell you she rebooked? No, she did not, and for good reason. She knows I'd have a fit. He had to work hard not to laugh. Leave it to Emma to complain about an upgrade. What's wrong with first class? Everything. It's elitist and overpriced and a waste of resources because fewer people fit in that space. Jenny had clearly wimped out and left him to deal with Emma's objections. So he would. Going first class was in his blood, and besides, booking at the last minute meant he wouldn't have been able to sit with her and coach. Instead, he would have been squashed into a middle seat in the tail section. Not his idea of fun, and inefficient to boot. He needed to be right beside her when they deplaned. He wasn't letting her out of his sight until he'd made sure Theo Henderson wouldn't do something stupid. Buying 2 new tickets had seemed like the way to go. With Wallace Enterprises footing the bill, Jenny had agreed. Although she'd mentioned Emma might not be happy about it. Emma was definitely not happy. She stood in front of him throwing off sparks of irritation. But unless she wanted to give up on the Chicago part of her tour, she was stuck with him in first class. "I'm sorry you're upset about the seats," he said. "But they can't be changed. At this point." "I suppose not. Most people would be grateful, wouldn't they?" "I would say so. It just goes against my principles." "Sorry. At least we're taking public transportation." She stared at him. "Don't tell me you considered taking the Wallace corporate jet." "Jenny said you'd never go for it." "That's a colossal understatement." She shook her head in obvious dismay. "The corporate jet? So you're actually slumming by taking this flight?" "Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way." She heaved the sigh of someone whose burdens were too much to bear. "I suppose I'll have to consider this research. Shall we go?" He swept a hand toward the gate. "After you." She was all smiles for the woman taking tickets, but she remained cool toward Aiden as they made their way down the jetway to the plane. Because they hadn't boarded with the rest of first class, coach passengers were lined up ahead of them waiting to get on. That meant standing together in the jetway as an awkward silence developed between them. Aiden decided to break it before it became a solid block of ill will. "You'll only have to endure this for one leg of your tour," he said. "When you leave Chicago on Sunday, you'll be in the seat Jenny reserved in the first place." She glanced at him. "I didn't mean to be a brat about it, but I don't like having someone manipulate my life without telling me. Jenny should have, but she didn't. I was wrong to take it out on you. I apologize." "Apology accepted. And I confess that if I can't take the corporate jet, I'm all about first class. I don't fit into the coach seats very well." "I guess you wouldn't. And considering how bogus the whole trip is for you, I can't expect you to make it crammed into coach, which would only add insult to injury." "Who said it was bogus?" As the line began moving again, he and Emma moved with it. Looking over her shoulder at him, she rolled her eyes. "Come on, Aiden. Jenny told me he's 19. He read one of my books and now he's enjoying a vicarious thrill by sending me emails pretending that he has special powers." His senses sharpened. "Did you mean to say emails as in more than one?" "He sent a couple more, both early this morning. Now that I know he's a kid, they don't worry me. I think your father and my publisher are making way too much of this, and now they've included you in the insanity." She walked forward toward the doorway of the plane. "You didn't delete the emails, did you?" "I thought about it, but no, I haven't." She walked onto the plane. "Thank God for small favors." He followed her. "Window or aisle?" "Window. I love looking out." That worked nicely for him. Even in first class his legs felt cramped if he ended up by the window, so he always chose the aisle. The flight attendant took Emma's coat and hung it up. For a moment Aiden thought Emma would insist on hanging up her own coat, but then she relinquished it, thanked the attendant, and took her seat. She tucked her computer case under the seat in front of her and sat back. Aiden's finely tuned hearing picked up a little sigh of pleasure and he turned away so she wouldn't hear him chuckle. She might disapprove of first class seats on principle, but her body loved being cushioned in that comfy leather. Then he groaned inwardly as his hormone-soaked brain focused on that sensuous little body of hers nestled in the seat that would be next to his. Hours ago, he'd convinced himself he could do this without danger of sprouting fur, and yet the backs of his hands were already starting to prickle. He handed off his topcoat and tucked his own computer case under the seat in front of them. "Mind if I take a look at those 2 emails?" "Be my guest." Attendant came by asking about coffee. He smiled at the attendant and shook his head before going back to the screen. "And Theo's messages?" "Regular with just a tiny bit of cream, please," Emma said. He glanced up. She'd been taking 2 creams for the past 3 months. Why? Only a tiny bit. Because cream is fattening and I'm cutting back. You're dieting? I always do after turning in a book. I tend to eat more when I'm on deadline. So this is how I balance it out. She fastened her seatbelt. He hadn't meant to watch her do that, but he couldn't seem to keep himself from observing how the belt rode low and tight over her hips, exactly as the flight attendant would instruct them to fasten it during takeoff. Emma had terrific hips in his estimation. She had terrific everything. He'd hate to see even an ounce disappear from that curvy figure. Then he heard himself say against all good judgment, "But you're perfect." Her eyes rounded. "Excuse me. I meant that you're perfectly okay now. I don't get the dieting thing." "Thank you." She took a breath. "You confuse the hell out of me, Aiden." "I'm not surprised. I confuse myself sometimes. The other night I thought you were interested in me, but then I decided you weren't. Now you seem interested again. I'm getting whiplash." Aiden grabbed the first lifeline he could think of. "You said you had a boyfriend. So that's why you didn't come up the other night?" When he looked into those blue eyes of hers, he had a hard time lying. "No, not really. I didn't think so." He could tell her some of the truth at least. "The fact is I tend to have a one-track mind and I was focused on tracing that email. I knew if I came up to your loft I'd lose focus." "You're quite the dedicated guy, aren't you?" "Guess so." "I admire that, Aiden." She looked past him toward the aisle. "Thank God. My coffee's here. Your first cup." He helped the flight attendant pass the steaming cup over to her. "'Fraid so. I was a little rushed this morning." He started to say that explained a lot about her quick temper but stopped himself. "Ah, manna from heaven." She closed her eyes and breathed in the vapors before taking a long slow sip. "I think I'll live now." He couldn't resist. "In coach they won't get coffee until we reach altitude and level off." "Smartass." She smiled though. "I understand the appeal of sitting up here. Maybe I'm afraid I'll get used to it. Get spoiled." "Would that be so terrible?" She studied him. "I think so. The money's coming in now, but I'm a self-employed writer. There's no guarantee the money will always be there. At this point I haven't made enough to keep me in first-class seats for the rest of my life." He stated what she had to be thinking. "Whereas I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth." "Pretty much." He nodded. "I'll own that. I probably am spoiled." He thought about the house where he had grown up, a 10-bedroom mansion filled with original art, maid, cooks, chauffeurs. His father was an investment genius and the family had weathered a couple of recessions without suffering. "Don't get me wrong," she said. "I've noticed that the people you employ are treated with respect and consideration. I've heard that the Wallace family supports a whole raft of charities. I'm not dissing your situation, but it's different from mine." She had no idea how different. "My dad abandoned my mom when I was a baby, and she managed to raise me and keep a roof over our heads, but it was never easy. I met your mom at the signing. She seems like an intelligent woman." Emma's eyes lit up. "She is." She mentioned that she'd stopped to say hello. "Listen about Doug, my boyfriend, The plane's engines revved, cutting off the rest of what she'd been about to say. Knowing he'd have to shut down her phone any second, Aiden quickly glanced over Theo's 2 emails. "Hear you're coming to Cheetown, sweet thing. Looking forward to making that special connection, if you know what I mean. I'm still ready for you." Aiden scrolled to the next one. "Hey there. Where's do it on all fours? Think about it. I'm always ready for you." Aiden ground some enamel off his back molars. Sure, Theo was just a kid, but even a kid could get himself and his fellow wers into deep trouble. That was Aiden's intellectual evaluation. But the emails affected him at a deeper level. Emma was not his mate, would never be his mate. And yet any sexual interest from another male aroused every possessive instinct he had. Maybe that wasn't a bad thing for the short term. Theo might not cower before someone sent as Emma's bodyguard, but he would cringe in fear if Aiden presented himself as Emma's mate, were ready to defend her to the death. Aiden wasn't certain he could play that role and then abandon it again on Sunday. Doing so could end the problem with Theo, though. He'd have to think about it. "Sir," the flight attendant said, "I'll have to ask you to turn off your phone." "Right." He quickly put his cell number in a vacant speed dial position. Then He powered down the phone and handed it back to Emma as the attendant went through the seatbelt and flotation device spiel. You now have me in your emergency contacts. Oh, she looked annoyed. I guess that's okay. You can change it on Sunday afternoon. Don't worry. I will. He settled back in his seat and tried to imagine himself running through the forest. Flying made him uneasy, which was another reason for choosing first class. Wolves weren't meant to be suspended 30,000 feet in the air. Flying made his ears hurt and dried out his sinuses. When he flew alone he drowned out the engine noise by wearing top-grade earphones tuned to a medley of forest sounds, but that wouldn't be happening today. As they taxied down the runway, he gripped the armrests and swallowed. Visualization wasn't working for him this morning. Emma must have noticed, because she glanced at him with undisguised curiosity. Aiden, are you afraid of flying? No. You are so. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Lots of people are spooked by the idea of being up in the air with no visible means of support. Thanks for that description. Aiden closed his eyes and clenched his jaw. Each time he did this he promised himself he'd try hypnosis next time. But he never remembered until it was too late, and he was headed for the airport. I've found the best remedy is distraction, Emma said. So let's talk about something unrelated to flying. How about the weather? Aiden groaned. Ice on the wings. I'd forgotten about that. We could end up with ice on the wings and we'd go down like a rock. Okay, then politics. The world situation. Terrorists. Somebody could be on the plane with a bomb and we'd never know. On a train or a bus you have a fighting chance, but up in the air. How about my love life? We could talk about that. Aiden opened his eyes and turned his head to stare at her. You're going to tell me about your love life. See? You're already distracted. Go on. It did help to focus on her. He couldn't very well take her with him on every future flight, but for now she was a great solution. What about your love life? You know that boyfriend I told you about? Yes. He knew way more about Dougie Boy than she could imagine. We're taking a break from each other. It shouldn't matter to him at all, but a surge of excitement told him it mattered, all right. Since when? Yesterday. Emma, if this has anything to do with me, that's not good because It does and it doesn't. It does because I had such a great time on Wednesday night that I realized Doug and I might not be right for each other, so I thank you for that. We needed to take a break. Look, if you're thinking we might hook up, there are several reasons why that wouldn't be a good idea. All he had to do was figure out which ones he could tell her without making her suspicious about his family. She laughed. You are so right about that. Several I can think of. What do you mean? He thought he'd have all the reasons on his side. Well, I'll be the first to admit that my next lover will be physically more like you and less like Doug. That's flattering. He sincerely doubted her next lover would be physically anything like him. I can't deny that I'm very attracted to you physically, but I'm looking for someone who recycles the Sunday Times. I do that. Why he felt the need to mention it was beyond him. Besides, he only left instructions for his maid to recycle it, which might not count for as much in her book. I'm glad you do. Recycling is a small thing though. I need someone who rides the subway and flies coach, someone who has to think twice before he buys a ticket to a Broadway play and has to save for months in order to afford a tropical vacation. The truth is, Aiden, gorgeous though you are, you're too rich for my blood. Aiden tried to remember if any woman had said that to him in his life. No, none had. He had the impression that most women saw his money as an aphrodisiac. They liked the luxuries it could provide: exotic getaways, fine food, sensuous spa treatments. He wouldn't date a woman who only cared about money, but enjoying the thrills money could buy wasn't a crime. Except to Emma, apparently. I do believe I've shocked you, Aiden. Could be. Distracted you pretty well too, didn't I? Look out the window. We're airborne. He leaned past her to check that out, and sure enough they'd lifted above the layer of winter cloud suspended over New York City. Leaning closer to her wasn't such a good idea though. Her scent filled his nostrils and he remembered the way her lips had felt pressed against his on Wednesday night. Turning slightly, he gazed into her eyes as a wave of lust moved through him. Too rich for your blood, huh? Her breath caught and her lips parted slightly. Yes. And all along I thought you were too rich for mine. With a supreme effort, He leaned back in his seat and stared straight ahead while he fought against the arousal that was making the backs of his hands prickle and his tailbone ache. Shifting at 30,000 feet would not be a good thing. Chapter 6. Emma wasn't always so quick on her mental feet, but she'd executed a nice two-step that time. She'd managed to tell Aiden the exact truth and restore her sense of dignity in one fell swoop. Nice work if she did say so. She still didn't know where he stood. Those mixed signals continued to be mixed. No matter. He knew where she stood, and that was a safe and sane distance away from him. Discovering he was afraid of flying had given her another boost of confidence. Up to now she'd thought he was a perfect specimen with no faults to speak of. A fear of flying didn't make him any less manly or yummy, but it did make him human. Unsnapping her lap belt, she leaned over and pulled her computer case out from under the seat in front of her. Now would be a good time to flip open her laptop and present a picture of the working writer. She doubted she'd get much done sitting next to Aiden's hunky self, but he wouldn't know if she was working or composing a letter. Best of all, he wouldn't be inclined to start a conversation while she was typing. She was happy with the current balance of power, and another discussion might upset it. He affected her more than she wanted him to know. But the good news was that it cut both ways. After booting up her computer, she had to come up with something to type and decided she might as well brainstorm ideas for her next book. She'd never considered whether werewolves would mind flying, but logically they wouldn't be very well suited to it. So far as she knew, no furry creature enjoyed the change in air pressure or the noise and smell of jet fuel. She could create a plot which would require her hero to overcome his resistance to flying in order to save the heroine from something or other. Maybe she was a bush pilot in Alaska. That worked. She could crash land in a remote area populated by a pack of werewolves. Maybe she'd be hurt in such a way that she'd have to teach the hero/werewolf how to fly, or she'd be forever stranded there. As the story outline took shape, she found herself on a roll. Instead of being distracted by Aiden sitting next to her, she was inspired by his solid presence and his scent. Yes, his actual scent, which she still couldn't identify despite having all these close encounters. Aiden had taken out his computer too, and was looking through some files. One quick glance told her it was some sort of spreadsheet. At some point she admitted that this was very nice, writing up in first class where a person could get a glass of juice anytime they wanted it. She liked having room to work on a laptop without being squished, and she most especially liked sitting beside a man who smelled as good as Aiden. But she'd meant what she'd said. Despite enjoying the heck out of this experience today, she was only gathering material for her research. She wrote about rich people as well as middle class and poor people. Hanging out with Aiden temporarily would help her write a more realistic rich person. From the corner of her eye she studied his hands. They looked strong and supple, with a light dusting of hair over the backs. His nails were neatly trimmed, maybe by a manicurist. He had no cuts or scratches on his hands and no visible calluses, which made sense. He was a businessman, not a laborer. His cheeks were perfectly shaven too, and his hair trimmed as if he had it done every few days. Wallace Enterprises probably had a barber on staff. The rich, or at least this rich family, appeared to be well groomed. Like what you see? His cheek creased in a smile. Sorry, I didn't mean to stare. That's okay. He glanced at her. My ego loves it. I have a research question, in case I want to create a character who's rich. Laughter danced in his golden eyes. The PC word is wealthy. Is that so? Then why was there a TV show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? Easier to market maybe, but trust me, the word people with money actually uses wealthy. I don't see what's wrong with rich. It's short, to the point, punchy. Hemingway would have liked it a lot better than wealthy. Aiden powered down his laptop and closed the cover. Are you sure about that? Because if you use rich to mean that someone has a lot of money, what can you use to describe a thick wedge of chocolate cake with dark chocolate frosting? Decadent. You're using 3 syllables when 1 syllable would do. Okay then. Moist. And thanks a lot, because now I want some of that, and there goes my diet. She loved talking about words, but she didn't meet too many men who would debate language choice with her. Moist isn't good enough. A sponge can be moist, but it sure as hell isn't rich. How about intense? The conversation was becoming something of a turn-on. He shook his head. Not the same. If I tell you the chocolate cake is rich, Then you can almost taste it. I guess. She remembered not long ago, when she told him he was too rich for her blood, he'd countered that she was too rich for his. Now that comment took on a whole other meaning, one that she'd do well to forget about. She had no doubt that if they ever ended up in bed, the experience would be exceedingly rich. Good thing the world included chocolate, which she'd always found was a decent substitute for hot sex. You don't suppose they have any chocolate cake on the plane? I'm getting a real craving here. He reached up and pressed the call button. Let's see. But alas, they soon discovered the galley wasn't stocked with cake. Aiden glanced at his watch. We land in 30 minutes. Can you wait 45 for that cake? Obviously you haven't looked at the schedule. We go straight from the airport to a radio interview. There's no cake time in there. Sure there is. You'll have your cake and eat it too. That's cute, Aiden, but we're not going to cruise along Michigan Avenue looking for a deli and end up being late for the interview. I'm a big girl. And I'm supposed to be dieting. I can live without cake. But you don't have to. He gave her a slow smile. You're with me. Dear God, that smile was turning her into a pile of goo. She barely had the breath to respond. What do you mean by that? As I said, cake is rich. I'm wealthy. And proud of it, I see. She didn't want to be impressed by his cool confidence tinged with a certain amount of sexy arrogance. She didn't want to feel like Cinderella at the ball. But that pretty much described her situation. She could fight it and him, or she could sit back and enjoy the view from the pumpkin coach. The second option made more sense than the first. But she'd have to be careful not to enjoy it too much. The flight attendant came by and asked them to stow their computers for the landing, and she noticed that Aiden tensed up. Most people who were afraid of flying tended to dread the takeoff and landing the most. If she drew him into another conversation, he might forget that they were in a descent. She'd meant to ask him something else before they got into the semantics of wealthy versus rich. What had it been? Oh yes, his hair. I never asked my research question, she said. He glanced over at her. You're trying to distract me from the landing, aren't you? Uh-huh. I appreciate that. Once again, his fingers gripped the armrests. Go for it. Does your family have a hairstylist on retainer? His quick grin told her she'd hit on a subject that amused him. You mean like the Hollywood stars who have somebody following them around with a pair of scissors and a blow dryer? Well, yeah. What's so funny? I'm trying to picture my dad putting up with that, or my mom for that matter. But there is a salon on the ground floor of the building where we have our offices. A building your family owns, I assume. Right, but we rent out most of it, and one of the tenants is a top-notch salon. We go in when we need to. No big deal. What about your fingernails? Why are they dirty? He lifted both hands and inspected them. Just the opposite. They look manicured. She congratulated herself on getting him to let go of the armrests. I trim them myself, but that's all I do. The whole family has strong nails. And teeth. When he'd lifted his hand, she'd noticed his watch. Is that a Rolex? No. It's a Blancpain. Huh. I've never heard of that, which probably means it's super expensive. Hundreds probably. When he didn't respond, she figured she was low. Thousands. Well, I didn't buy it, but I guess it cost a little under $800. Thousand. She gasped. No. Then she glanced at him to see if he was kidding. You're making that up. Nope. It was a birthday present from my folks, so I don't know the exact cost, but there are a limited number of these made, which makes them pricey. Pricey? You're wearing the equivalent of a really nice apartment in Brooklyn on your wrist and you call it pricey? I call it outrageous. He unbuckled the strap and handed it to her. If you take a closer look, you'll see why it costs so much. There's a calendar on it as well as a lunar phase dial and the keep it away from me. Emma held up both hands. I don't want to lay a finger on a watch that's worth 800 grand. Oh, for heaven's sake. Take it. You said you wanted to do research on how the wealthy live. One thing we tend to do is buy limited edition watches like this. Why? She took the watch as if handling a live bomb. The strap and metal case were seductively warm. Because we value the workmanship and the tradition of watchmaking. At least, that's what my dad said when he gave it to me. He expects me to pass it on to one of my kids. Thinking of him with children sent a little pang of longing zinging through her heart. It was just a little pang though, because he was so out of her league. She chose to underline that fact. I'd hate to be the kid who inherits this. Watch. Just my luck I'd leave it in a locker at the gym or accidentally knock it into the sink when the garbage disposal was running. I'll admit I have to be more careful with it than I would be with a cheaper watch. No kidding. You do realize you could get a Casio which would do most of this stuff. I have a phone that does most of this stuff. But it's a Wallace tradition. We're really good watches. Rourke has one that's worth about the same or maybe even a little more. She handed it back to him with great care. It's very classy looking, but then it should be for 800 large. Her mother had given her a watch for her high school graduation. It had cost around $50. True, it had gone on the fritz a couple of years after that, but she still had it in her dresser drawer because her mother had given it to her. I suppose I've never questioned spending this kind of money on a watch. He fastened the strap around his wrist again. That's the sort of thing I need to know for my research, the things a rich, I mean wealthy person takes for granted. He gazed at her. Let's say you had more money than you could ever spend. What would you do with it? Oh, that's easy. I'd buy my mom an apartment somewhere on Central Park West. Because she's always talked about how wonderful it would be to live there, alongside people like Barbra Streisand. Then I'd get her a country home in upstate New York where she could spend her vacations. You don't think that would be too extravagant? He asked the question as if he really wanted to know. Of course it would be extravagant, but you said I'd have more money than I knew what to do with. After I got her all set up, I'd research what charities to support, maybe start a foundation of some kind. He smiled. Would you buy a Blancpain watch? That would be a negative. The wheels of the plane touched down on the runway. And we're in Chicago. That's the best time I've ever had on a plane, Emma. Thank you. So should I assume you've never become a member of the Mile High Club? He stared at her a moment before starting to laugh. That would be negative. Because of your fear of flying? No, because of my fear of getting stuck permanently in an airplane bathroom. Still smiling, he studied her. You would fit though if the guy wasn't huge. Are you a member? That would be a negative. He was definitely teasing her. Then how are you ever going to write about it if you haven't tried it? I don't have to research everything, Aiden. Obviously I have to use creative license for some things. It's not like I'm ever going to have sex with a werewolf, you know? Something flashed in his eyes, something that looked very much like desire. Then it was gone. No, I guess you won't ever do that. She had an epiphany. God, she should have figured it out earlier. Aiden wasn't all that different from Theo, the 19-year-old kid who'd emailed her. Aiden had read her sex scenes and was convinced she was hot stuff in bed. If only that were true. She was hardly a virgin, but she'd never experienced the kind of mindless ecstasy she wrote about. She wasn't even positive it existed in the real world. She could tell him that she used her imagination for the sex in the books too, but he might not believe her. He was a man, carried away by a fantasy she'd created. But he had sense enough to know that they came from completely different worlds, and once the sex was over, whether it lived up to his expectations or not, they'd have nothing much in common. She wouldn't feel at home in his world, and he wouldn't want to scale down his lifestyle to fit into hers. Correction, he wouldn't scale down his lifestyle, as evidenced by the fact they'd flown to Chicago first class. True, he'd given up the corporate jet. But now he was in Chicago, a city full of luxury options. As she thought about that, she wondered if he'd made any other changes. I understand the media escort was cancelled, she said. Did you book a rental car? A car and driver will meet us at the airport and take us wherever we need to go. She should have guessed that he wouldn't be driving her around in a compact from Hertz. I forgot to ask about your accommodations while we're here. Were you able to get a room at the hotel? He looked wary. We'll be at the Palmer House instead. She should have guessed that too. The Palmer House was historic and would feel to old money. The penthouse. It was available. I'll just bet it was. She'd heard about it, 11 rooms of luxury, but had never expected to see it in person. You can consider it research. Don't worry, Aiden. That's exactly what I'll do. No doubt about it, she'd be traveling in the pumpkin coach this weekend. She might as well relax and enjoy the ride. Chapter 7. Aiden switched on his phone while they were still on the plane and called the car service. While the flight attendant helped Emma on with her coat, he gave the driver quick instructions. Whatever it took, he wanted a single serving of chocolate cake from one of Chicago's best bakeries to be waiting in the town car by the time he and Emma reached it. Yes, he was showing off, and yes, he should cut it out. But he couldn't resist making this happen. He ended the call right as Emma turned around. Just checking to make sure the car service is on time, he said. They wouldn't dare be late, would they? He had to smile. She was beginning to get the picture. The cake would blow her away. No, but it doesn't hurt to give them a nudge. Getting off the plane took a while, and Aiden was grateful because the cake wasn't going to be an easy trick. He expected one person to be waiting with a sign at the end of the concourse and another to be running down the cake request. In any event, a chauffeur holding a sign printed with the name Wallace waited as they left the secure area of O'Hare. Aiden approached the man, who was a short, compact guy of about 45. He wore a navy blazer and no hat, but his most distinguishing feature was a long, handlebar mustache. None of the werewolves Aiden knew sported facial hair. They usually got enough of that when they shifted. Aiden didn't pick up any werewolf vibes from the chauffeur, so apparently Aiden's secretary had gone outside the community for this service. Fortunately, Aiden hadn't felt the presence of any wers at all since getting off the plane. That meant Theo hadn't somehow found out Emma's flight information, which was a good thing. Maybe they'd be lucky and Theo wouldn't show up all weekend, but Aiden doubted that. He approached the chauffeur and held out his hand. "I'm Aiden Wallace." The chauffeur gave him a firm shake. "Barry Dinsmore. Welcome to Chicago, Mr. Wallace." He glanced over at Emma. "Ma'am, I'll take your carry-on." "Thanks, but I'd rather keep it." Emma clutched the handle of her rolling computer case as if it contained the secrets of the ages. Aiden had noticed her typing up a story idea on the plane, so in a way the computer could be more valuable to her than gold. He hoisted his computer case strap over his shoulder. "Then we're off." "Wait." Emma stood rooted to the floor in the middle of the stream of passengers. "I have checked baggage. Just give Barry your claim check. Someone will take care of it." "Someone? But I don't." She looked uncertain. "It'll be fine, Emma. I promise you'll get your luggage." He flicked a glance in the chauffeur's direction. "You can handle that, right?" "Absolutely, sir. All I need is the claim check." "Okay. Although this seems very weird." Emma rummaged through her purse and produced her ticket envelope with the claim check stapled to it. "You can't miss which one is mine. At least I don't think you can. It's orange, but I've written my name on the luggage tag in case there are 2 orange suitcases." "Orange. Got it. And it's about so big." She measured the size with her hands. "Oh, and I have a lime green ribbon tied on the handle to make it even easier to identify." Aiden tried not to shudder. This was why he'd wanted to take the corporate jet, so they wouldn't be dealing with the horrors of baggage claim and orange suitcases with green ribbons tied on the handle. Emma would no doubt call him a snob for those thoughts, so he kept them to himself. "I'll remember that, ma'am," the chauffeur said. "First I'll settle you both in the car, and then I'll fetch your luggage. If you'll follow me." Emma turned to Aiden as they trailed after the chauffeur. "What about you? Don't you have luggage?" "You don't want to know." "Probably not, but you might as well tell me. Are you buying a new wardrobe when we get to the hotel?" "No. I had my clothes delivered to the penthouse last night. They're already hanging in the closet." "Of course they are." She threw up both hands. "Why didn't I think of that?" "Give yourself time." Aiden was struggling not to laugh. "You'll get the hang of this." "No, I won't. I'll never get the hang of how the other half lives. As crazy." "Here's the thing, Emma. By traveling with me, you'll be safer than you would be if you traveled by yourself. That's part of the security service. The resources of Wallace Enterprises will create a protective barrier around you while you're in Chicago, where this Theo character lives. All this for a 19-year-old. If he knew, he'd be so flattered. Trust me, he will know. One of the tactics will be letting him think you're engaged to me." "Hey, you can't just spring something like that on me, Aiden. I should have something to say about it, don't you think? If we were really engaged, you'd have everything to say about it. But this is a security measure that has nothing to do with reality. All you have to do is go along with me on it." She walked in silence beside him, her back rigid. Emma? Will you roll with this concept or not? You could have warned me. How long have you been planning to handle the weekend this way? He hesitated to tell her that he'd come up with the idea before they'd left New York. He'd been trying to figure out how to tell her and had hoped he could do it over cake. Not long, he said. Until just recently I was still working out the details. How recently? This morning on the way to the airport. She stopped so quickly a man behind her almost ran over her. He muttered curses as he swerved around them. Are you telling me you're making this up as you go along? No. Look, I haven't had a lot of time to work on the strategy and I'm refining it as ideas come to me. At first I thought being your media escort would be the perfect cover, but then I realized Theo wouldn't be put off by a media escort. A fiancé, though, is another story. As I've said before, Aiden, I don't need all this firepower. Chances are we won't see Theo at all, but if I'm wrong and he shows up at the autograph table with a lewd suggestion, I'll tell him to get lost. That should take care of it. Barry turned around with a questioning glance. Mr. Wallace? Will you and Ms. Gavin be coming with me then? Yes. Aiden cupped Emma's elbow and guided her toward the exit. Touching her at all sent shivers of awareness through his system, but they needed to get moving. We'll talk more in the car. She allowed herself to be hustled along. We can do that, but I really don't like the fake engagement idea. I realize authors aren't front-page news, but if there's even the slightest chance word could get back to my mother, then does she know about the emails? No, and I don't want her to. She has a tendency to be overprotective as it is. When I first moved out of her apartment and into my loft, she checked on me twice a day. That's tapered off some, but if she thinks I have some cyber stalker on my trail, she'll camp out in my living room for the duration. Love her to death, but she could make my life a living hell. Aiden wondered what Betty Gavin would do if she discovered her daughter was about to spend the weekend at the Palmer house with a werewolf. So that means she doesn't know I tagged along for your Chicago leg of the book tour either. Are you kidding? Just asking. He broke the connection between them so they could each navigate the revolving door leading outside. I didn't tell her I broke up with Doug either. The combination of that announcement and telling her I need you as a bodyguard on this trip would make her assume I got rid of Doug because you and I are lovers. What a disaster that would be. Oh, that pricked his ego more than a little. You know what I mean. I'm not sure I do. He handed Barry his computer case and the chauffeur loaded it and Emma's case into the front seat of the town car. I'm just saying that it would be bad enough if she thought we were lovers when we're not. If she hears through the grapevine that we're engaged when we're not, well, I can't even imagine the fallout. I can see the problem. And he did what had seemed like a brilliant plan during the plane ride now looked less than brilliant considering how Emma's mother might react if she accidentally heard about any of this. Aiden understood the tricky nature of family dynamics. The Wallace pack had its share of issues. Barry held open the back door of the town car and helped Emma inside. Aiden followed her in and noted the interior of the car smelled like chocolate. This trip was becoming more complicated by the minute, so he hoped that at least the cake would be good. I can't believe this. Emma stared at the silver tray Barry settled on her lap. In the center sat a large wedge of chocolate cake with dark chocolate frosting topside up, no less, on a crystal plate. At least it looked like crystal. Considering how the trip had gone so far, she'd be willing to bet it was. An ornate silver fork lay on a linen napkin beside the plate. Bon appetit, Barry said as he closed the passenger door. I'll be right back with your luggage. That won't work. She glanced over at Aiden. He can't leave the car parked here while he gets the luggage. We'll be ticketed. Trust me, we won't be ticketed. What do you mean? Of course we will. Or worse yet, we'll be hooked up to a tow truck and... She trailed off as Aiden simply smiled at her. Did you bribe someone? Not necessary. Barry propped the sign with the Wallace name on it in the front window. She looked at the front windshield and sure enough, that placard was leaning against it. So what, the Wallaces have diplomatic immunity or something? Or something. Aren't you going to eat your cake? She gazed at the piece of cake, which had those clever curls of shaved chocolate on the top layer of frosting and one perfect, red strawberry nestled in the curls. A strawberry in February. Her tummy growled. Yes, I'm going to eat this cake before Barry gets back so I won't end up with it in my lap when he starts going 80 on the outer drive. He won't go 80. Sure he will. She picked up the fork and unfolded the napkin in the little strip of her lap that wasn't covered by the tray. I'm sure nobody will ticket him for speeding either. I'm surprised there's not a little Wallace family flag suction cup to the car. There is. No way. Where? It's on the back fender. I guess you missed seeing it when we got in. I most certainly did. Emma picked up the heavy silver tray and handed it to him. Hold this. I have to see the flag. Aiden obligingly took the tray while she unbuckled her shoulder harness and turned around so she could get on her knees and peer out the back window. I'll be damned. She studied the purple flag, which was suitably small and tasteful at about 9 inches square. Because there was no breeze she couldn't see the crest clearly, but it was definitely a family crest. What's on it, a pile of gold bullion? Very funny. I'm sorry. She looked over at him. That was snarky and you don't deserve snarky when you went to all the trouble of getting me that cake, which I'm patiently holding for you. And Barry will be back any minute. You're right. She slid back down to her seat and refastened the shoulder harness. Thanks for holding my cake. She took the tray and felt the brush of his fingers against hers. Zing. She was aware of him all over again. At least she had cake to eat. She picked up the ornate fork, which looked as if it came out of an antique set of silverware. Eating in front of you feels very rude. Don't worry about it. I'm not a chocoholic. She sliced down through the moist layers. Are you implying that I am? You sure reacted like one when I mentioned rich chocolate cake. Then I might as well confess. Coffee and chocolate are my 2 favorite vices. She took the first bite and moaned happily. Good. She savored the taste and decided it might be the best chocolate cake she'd ever had in her life. Rich. That made her laugh. Yes, and moist and decadent too. It's a crime to eat a dessert like this fast. A person should take her time and draw out the pleasure. I hate to just wolf it down. He glanced out the window, as if searching the sidewalk for Barry and her suitcase. Then don't. Even if Barry does 80, we won't get to the bookstore for a while. Yes, but I'd like to get to the bookstore without chocolate smeared all over myself. Aiden made a funny little noise in the back of his throat. She glanced over at him. Is anything wrong? Are you hungry? I'm fine. But he didn't look fine to her. He looked sort of feverish. And the backs of his hands, had they always been that hairy? Maybe she'd been so fixated on the watch she hadn't noticed. He was a manly guy who probably had lots of healthy hair on his chest and his legs. He might even have hair on his back, although she hoped not. That was a turnoff for her. As if that mattered. She wasn't going to be seeing his naked back, so whether he had hair growing there or not was a moot point. About that time Barry arrived pulling her orange suitcase. At the time she'd bought it, she hadn't been worried about whether the suitcase was stylish. Her goal was to own a suitcase that didn't look like every other one circling the belt and baggage claim. She'd succeeded in that goal. Neon orange with little pink hearts on it, the suitcase could put your eyes out. She hadn't wanted to mention the little pink hearts when she described the suitcase to Barry earlier, and after all, the predominant color was orange. Very orange. Your luggage is here, Aiden said. Kind of hard to miss seeing that. She took another big bite of cake. I'm afraid I left my Louis Vuitton at home. He turned to her and smiled. Fortunately his eyes had lost that feverish look, too. You don't have any Louis Vuitton. No, but I had to say that and see if you were paying attention. As Barry loaded her suitcase in the trunk, she scarfed up some more cake. It was a darn shame to gobble a cake this fine, but she didn't trust herself not to make a mess. Barry climbed behind the wheel. All set. Ready to roll back there. I still have cake, Barry. If you can avoid quick lane changes while I'm finishing it, I'd be most appreciative. I'll do my best, Miss Gavin. He pulled away from the curb slowly. Barry, are you going to be our driver for the entire weekend? Yes, ma'am, I am. Then please call me Emma. I have a feeling we'll be old friends by Sunday. Barry's smile was reflected in the rear-view mirror. That would be nice. I've only met a couple of live authors before. Met any dead ones? Barry chuckled. Good comeback. No, I haven't met any dead ones, but I have a friend down in New Orleans who swears he has. I like New Orleans. It's a great town. She looked over at Aiden, thinking to include him in the conversation she'd started with Barry. Have you been there? She took another good-sized bite of cake. No. Wallace Enterprises contributed quite a bit to the rebuilding effort after Hurricane Katrina, but I've never been there. You should go sometime. The chocolate cake was improving her mood by leaps and bounds. It's sort of spooky, but then I enjoy spooky, as you can imagine. Considering the books I write. You mean pretend spooky? Well, yeah, I guess so. It's fun to scare yourself a little with imaginary things. She dropped a glob of chocolate frosting, which landed on her napkin. Fortunately, next time it could land on the front of her turquoise suit jacket though. She studied the situation and decided she'd do better if she picked up the plate and held it closer to her mouth. She had about a third of the cake to go, and Barry had promised to drive carefully. She sliced off another chunk. Damn it. Barry swore at the same moment he slammed on the brakes. Sorry about that, Emma. But this jerk in front of me cut me off. That's unfortunate, Barry. She put the empty plate back on the silver tray. Because now I'm wearing the cake. Chapter 8. From the moment Emma had mentioned getting chocolate smeared all over herself, Aiden had wondered if he'd pay for this ego trip of providing her with cake. Now it seemed that he would pay dearly. She'd managed to get both cake and frosting all over the front of her turquoise suit jacket and the white lace camisole underneath. Worse yet, it was smashed into her cleavage. The fantasy picture of her naked and smeared in chocolate had somewhat come true, but not in a good way. The erotic overtones would all be there, with no possibility that he'd be able to satisfy the lust they would inspire. Double whammy. She glanced down at the mess before looking over at him with a bemused expression. Then she began to laugh. That only made things worse. If she'd ranted and raved about her ruined outfit, or if she'd blamed him for coming up with the stupid cake plan in the first place, he'd have been able to bury his cravings under the weight of her anger. But no, she'd chosen to be a good sport about it, and he was a sucker for a good sport. Just his luck that wouldn't be happening. Still, he had to help her figure this out. Barry was casting worried glances in the rearview mirror and sending out a stream of apologies. Despite Emma's amused reaction, Aiden chose the solution that he would have wanted for himself. Barry, reprogram your GPS and take us to the nearest Nordstrom's. Cancel that, Barry. Emma gulped air and sank back onto the seat. No. Shopping trips. I have something in my suitcase that will work fine. I just need a plan for changing out of this and into that gas station, Barry suggested. Aiden shook his head. No. Yes, Aiden. A gas station restroom will work fine. He grimaced. But it might be cramped and, he gestured dismissively. And dirty? It might, but you don't have to go in there, and my sensibilities aren't as delicate as yours. However, before I get out of the car, I should probably wipe some of the cake and frosting off. Otherwise, I'm liable to get it on the upholstery, and then it'll spread everywhere. His libido presented him with a graphic picture of chocolate everywhere on the seat because he proceeded to take what he wanted, spreading the chocolate, spreading her legs. I'm afraid the napkin's compromised and I don't have any tissues in my purse. Thankfully, she seemed oblivious to his mental state. Do you by chance have a pocket handkerchief that wasn't hand-sewn by Swiss nuns? Maybe his sense of humor would save him. He reached into his hip pocket and pulled out a monogrammed handkerchief. I'm sure the Swiss nuns would approve of using it to aid a damsel in distress. As Barry would say, nice comeback. She took the handkerchief. Thank you. Wow, this is really soft material. It's woven from the hair of sacred llamas cared for by extremely devout monks. She grinned at him. Okay. I'll lay off the smart remarks. It's just that I'm still thinking about that watch and shaking my head. He should concentrate on the intricate workings of his watch, Rourke's watch. Any damned watch. Something mechanical instead of a warm, willing, moist woman. This gas station looks as if it might be halfway decent, Barry said. If it's not, we'll go somewhere else. It'll be fine. Let's stop. Emma unfolded the handkerchief and glanced at the monogram. What does the F stand for? Phelan. It's a family name. A family name that meant wolf. Instead of giving first names that reference wolves, the Wallace pack chose to give middle names with that meaning to make the connection more subtle. There was nothing subtle about his wolf self right now, though. He was ready to howl. with frustration, and he could feel hair sprouting on the backs of his hands. I like it. She dipped her head and began wiping up some of the chocolate. Barry pulled the car up to the convenience storefront located beside the gas pumps. I'll get your suitcase out of the trunk. Great, thanks. You know what I hate about this the most, Aiden? She picked up a glob of icing from between her cleavage and licked it from her finger. I'm wasting almost a third of this luscious cake. He had to look away. His chest had begun to itch, and within 30 seconds, he'd have a start on his pelt. I'll wash out your handkerchief in the bathroom, but it'll take more than a quick rinse to get the chocolate out, I'm afraid. No problem. He was trying to focus on something besides her breasts, but when he looked to his right, he was presented with the image of some guy shoving a gas pump nozzle into the tank of his car. Aiden had never thought of that behavior as particularly sexual, but in his present mood it didn't take much to evoke the image of body parts connecting. Barry opened the door on her side. Do you want to take the whole suitcase in? That would be easier. She turned to Aiden. Will you hold the tray for me while I'm in the bathroom? Sure. He took the heavy silver tray gladly. Maybe its weight would hold down his growing erection. I'll be right back. We're losing some of that spare time we had before the interview. We'll make it, right, Barry? You bet we will, Mr. Wallace. You can call me Aiden. He smiled. We'll probably be old friends by Sunday. It's already starting out to be an interesting gig, if you don't mind my saying so. Barry sat sideways in the driver's seat so he could look over into the back. Sorry about that sudden stop. It was that or crash into him. It's not your fault. It's really mine for ordering the cake delivered. Aiden vowed to be less ego-driven and more practical for the rest of the weekend. It was a very cool gesture, though. We had to hustle to make it happen, but turned out well. Except for the last part, of course, when she slapped the plate against herself. That wasn't so good. No, but in spite of it all, Aiden cherished the memory of Emma glancing over at him and breaking out into laughter. He'd never forget that. From inside his suit coat pocket, his phone vibrated. He took it out and looked at the readout. Rourke, who no doubt wanted to know why in the hell Aiden had ignored all his warnings and headed out to Chicago with Emma. He'd deal with Rourke later, maybe during Emma's radio interview. Someone from your office in New York Express shipped that flag over, Barry said. We received it early this morning with instructions to leave it on the car all weekend. Aiden was so used to the flag that he didn't think about it anymore. It'll keep you from getting tickets. Barry nodded. Apparently so. I've never left a car in the loading zone that long before without getting one. The Wallaces must have some influence. We have business connections with the Henderson family. Barry's eyes rounded. The Henderson family? The one that owns a chunk of the Miracle Mile and most of Navy Pier. I believe so, yes. That explains a whole hell of a lot. Pardon my French, but the Henderson name gets you a lot in this town. No wonder you want that flag on the rear fender. Aiden decided he might be wise to enlist Barry in the cause. He leaned forward. There's something you need to know. What's that? Although the Wallaces and the Hendersons have a strong business connection, every family has a troublemaker. Barry blew out a breath. You don't have to tell me that. The Dinsmore family has more than one troublemaker. Is it the Wallaces or the Hendersons with a bad egg? The Hendersons. His name is Theo and he's 19. Barry rolled his eyes. 19. The perfect age to cause problems. The thing is, he might try to make contact with Emma this weekend. He concocted this story that he's a werewolf and therefore she needs to meet him. That's the lamest pickup line I've ever heard. Is that what she writes about? Werewolves. Yeah. She doesn't believe in them, of course, but this crazy kid figures if he claims to actually be one, he has an angle. I'll be on the lookout, but it wouldn't hurt for you to be watching, too. Aiden pulled a picture out of an inside pocket of his suit jacket. This is his high school graduation photo. But I understand he's let his hair grow. It's down to his shoulders now. Barry gazed at the wallet-sized picture of a gaunt young man with dark hair and eyes. His expression was more of a sneer than a smile. What do his parents think about him pretending to be a werewolf? That's where it gets tricky, Aiden said. I'm hoping to neutralize the problem without either of them finding out what he's up to. They're old family, friends of my father's, and he'd rather not embarrass them by exposing their son as a kook and a potential stalker. Lots of luck with that. Barry shook his head, which made his handlebar mustache wiggle. In my experience, it all comes out in the wash. But I'll keep an eye out for this character. Emma's a nice lady. I'd hate to see her being bothered by some nutcase. No offense to your friends and their kid, of course. None taken. He is a nutcase. And I intend to shut him down. You like her too, don't you? Aiden decided the chummy conversation needed to be dialed back a notch. She's an assignment. Barry obviously picked up on his tone. Sure. I understand. And I'll do what I can to help. Well, here she comes, all changed. Aiden looked toward the convenience store as Emma came toward the car pulling her orange suitcase. Barry hopped out and took it from her. She still wore her black trench coat, which had miraculously not been baptized by chocolate, but she'd traded her turquoise suit for a snug black turtleneck, sweater and gray slacks. Aiden liked that outfit as much or better than the turquoise suit. It occurred to him that it didn't matter what she wore. No matter what outfit she chose, she'd look like someone he wanted to strip naked and take to bed. That was damned inconvenient. She smiled as she climbed back into the car. No big deal. I'm going to take advantage of your pull in this town to get my turquoise suit clean so I can wear it when I head for Denver. I can make that happen once we get to the hotel. I'm sure you can. She fastened her shoulder harness as Barry pulled the car back into traffic. I don't want to get used to this level of service, but right now it'll come in handy. Want me to hold that tray now? That's okay. I'll be in charge of it. She brought her unique scent into the car with her. As his loins stirred in response, he settled the tray more firmly in his lap. It would serve as a reminder that he had to keep his Johnson in check. I checked out your flag and your family crest before I got back in the car. Okay. The creatures on the crest look something like wolves. That's because they are. He never had any trouble explaining the family crest because wolves were usually seen as noble animals. She gazed at him. Is that one of the reasons you picked up my books? Because your family's crest has wolves on it. In a way, she was closer to the truth than she imagined. She nodded. I've always had a thing for wolves myself. That's why I was drawn to the werewolf concept. Sometimes I wish they did exist, although I'd want them to be like my werewolves and not the way they're portrayed in some books, like ferocious beasts. So why did you decide to portray wolves the way you did instead of going with the ferocious beast concept? I studied wolves in college back when I thought I might go into wildlife management. They're awesome creatures who mate for life, and so logically, werewolves shouldn't be that different. That's if they were real, which they aren't. Right. He couldn't ever remember being so tempted to blurt out the truth. But that would be suicide. He was on this book tour to prevent Theo from revealing the existence of werewolves, so he could hardly blow the packs cover himself. Oh, I have your handkerchief. She opened her hand and it lay in the center of her palm in a soggy gray ball. I tried to wash it in the sink like I said, but I'll take it. He picked up the wet handkerchief and tried to think what he could do with it. If he shoved it back in his pocket, either the hip pocket or the front pocket, it would soon leave a damp place. Finally, he decided to drop it on the floor of the car. Don't do that. She looked horrified. Why not? Because it was woven from the hair of sacred llamas cared for by extremely devout monks. I made that up. I know, but regardless of how it was produced, it probably cost more than half my wardrobe, so you can't simply throw it on the floor of the car. He gazed at her. Sure I can. That's wasteful. Emma, you're going to have to get over yourself, at least for this weekend. She lifted her chin in an adorably defiant gesture. What do you mean by that? I mean that we're about to stay in a penthouse that would easily house an entire village in some third world country. We'll be the only two people in there, but I'll probably turn the heat up to at least 72 degrees, thereby contributing to global warming and the depletion of fossil fuels. Okay, but in addition to my unconscionable use of resources to heat those 11 rooms, I intend to take long hot showers because I love those, especially in the winter. Aiden, I'm not. And if there's some sort of jacuzzi arrangement, which I would expect, but I'm not sure, I'll be filling that tub and using those soothing jets to massage any tenseness I might have developed in the past few hours. He paused, and a devilish urge made him forget his common sense. If you hate the idea of all that water for one person, you're welcome to join me. She flushed. You and I both know that wouldn't be a smart idea. Maybe not psychologically, but when it comes to sharing resources, that's another issue, isn't it? He shouldn't taunt her because it only made his own frustration level grow, but she was so juicy. He'd known she would tempt him, but he hadn't factored in her overwhelming succulence. She looked adorably righteous, but that didn't detract from her desirability. One iota. As I've mentioned, I'll be considering this hotel stay part of my research. Then you'll want to check out all the amenities. Breakfast in bed, champagne in front of the fireplace, your favorite movies on the flat screen, along soak in a bubble bath. Her eyes narrowed. You've made your point, Aiden, and I promise not to lecture you about wasting resources again this weekend. Good. But you may not have as much time as you think to lounge in the jacuzzi. Have you checked the schedule? I glanced over it. Then you might remember that I have signings and interviews through this evening and all day tomorrow and tomorrow night as well. This is a book tour, not a pleasure trip. Perhaps you'd rather stay at the Palmer House while I take care of my obligations. I think not. Then good luck with your resource-wasting plans. He sighed. She'd bested him. He resented the way she dinged him about his wealth, and he tried to tempt her with the possibilities luxury accommodations could provide. Instead of falling for that, she'd reminded him of his duties and insinuated he was nothing more than an idle rich boy. That wasn't true. He worked hard, but he played hard too, and he hadn't allowed himself to do that recently. Obviously, he wouldn't be indulging in any playtime with Emma though, and that was the wisest course of action. Unfortunately, she wasn't tempted by the possibilities, but he sure as hell. Chapter 9. This is it. Aiden came toward the signing table carrying 3 books. After this, you're sold out. A cry of dismay went up from the line. I'm sorry, Emma called out. I can sign book plates for those of you who weren't able to get the actual book. She put down her pen and flexed her fingers. This kind of success was gratifying, validating, ego-boosting, and a whole bunch more adjectives she'd be able to think of if her brain hadn't shut down earlier tonight. She wouldn't trade this experience for anything except maybe at this very moment, for a long soak in the jacuzzi that Aiden had been so happy to dangle in front of her earlier today. She hadn't even seen the inside of the hotel, let alone the 11-room penthouse he'd described. They'd been on the go all day, hopping from her radio interview to a TV gig at WGN to a cocktail reception put on by a local library to this book signing. The ill-fated chocolate cake was the last thing she remembered eating. Although Aiden had brought her food at various points, food she must have eaten at least some of. She couldn't remember any of it. The cake, though, that would remain a memory forever. She wondered if Aiden had any sort of clue as to the fantasies that had bloomed in her active imagination the moment she accidentally smashed the cake onto her chest and thick, creamy frosting had worked its way between her breasts. That experience would rank as one of the most sensuous of her life. Gooey frosting sliding against her skin and sending chocolate fumes upward as it warmed to her body temperature. Life didn't get much better than that. Only one thing would have improved the sensation: having a man like Aiden lick it off. In her fantasy world, Barry the chauffeur would have been somehow taken out of the picture, snatched by aliens or something, so that she and Aiden could be alone in the back seat of the town car. Then she could have unfastened her seatbelt and turned to Aiden, who would also be out of his seatbelt. Giving him a searing glance, she'd ask if he could help her out. She seemed to have chocolate smeared all over the place. Emma! Aiden's voice snapped her out of her reverie. She wondered how long she'd stayed there staring at the book in front of her, which Aiden had helpfully opened to the title page. I'm sorry. She glanced up at the teenage girl standing in front of her. Who did you want this autograph to? She snagged her pen and poised it over the page. It's for this guy I know named Theo. Emma's hand trembled and she took another look at the teenager, who resembled all the others traipsing around the store, dark hair cut short, a black parka thrown over a snug white t-shirt and ripped jeans. Maybe it wasn't the same Theo, but she'd felt Aiden stiffen at hearing the name too. Emma decided to get this over quickly. She'd written to Theo when the girl started talking again. He's a huge fan, and he wants you to write something special in the book. He wanted so bad to be here tonight, but he had to work, so he asked me to come instead. Emma had a bad feeling about this. I'll just say thanks for your support. Emma started to write, but the girl laid a hand on her arm. He told me what he wanted in there. Here it is. She handed over a crumpled piece of lined notebook paper with a message scrawled across it that completely ignored the lines. The message said, "I'd love to meet you." "I'm sorry." Emma gazed at the girl. "I can't write that. My time in Chicago is very limited, and writing that would indicate that I plan to." The girl laughed. "Oh, I'm sure he doesn't think you'll really meet him, just so he can show his friends, you know? It's harmless." Aiden stepped closer to the table. "I'm sure it is, miss. I'm Terry Eisenbach. I'm sure it's harmless, Terry, but I'd like to talk to you privately for a minute." He rounded the table. "Let's go over by the coffee shop." "Sure, but I'll get the book, right? I mean, she already wrote to Theo, so she can't give it to one of the other people in line, right?" "You'll get the book," Emma said. She closed it and scooted it to one side as she greeted the next person in line, a young mother holding a sleeping baby. As Emma autographed the last 2 books and then several book plates, she wanted desperately to find out what Aiden was saying to the teenager. Maybe it was a good sign that Theo hadn't come to the store but had sent someone in his place. Maybe all he wanted out of this was an autographed book. Still, she couldn't write what he'd asked for. That was too creepy. As the last person left with a book plate in hand, she pulled Theo's book over and opened it to the title page. Hesitating for only a moment, she wrote "Best Wishes, Emma Gavin," and closed the cover with a snap. That was that. Aiden returned with Terry, who was sipping on a coffee drink which Emma figured Aiden had bought. The girl gazed up at him with worship in her dark eyes. Emma could easily understand that look. When Aiden turned on the charm, he was tough to resist. "Your assistant Aiden explained everything to me," Terry said. She spared Emma a quick glance, but she only had eyes for Aiden. I mean, who would imagine that a message in a book could turn into a legal thing? Emma shot Aiden a puzzled glance. He was now her assistant? And what legal thing was Terry talking about? He nodded wisely. "Anything's possible in this suit-happy climate. I'm not saying that Theo or his family would carry it that far, but Terry agrees that Theo's not the most stable person in the world." "No, he's not." Terry finally managed to tear her attention away from Aiden. "He might build it up in his mind that you'd actually meet him and flip out when you didn't. I guess his folks could sue for emotional damage or something. They have the money." "Oh, really?" Emma glanced at Aiden. "I didn't know Theo came from a wealthy family." "Oh yeah." Terry rolled her eyes. "The Hendersons are loaded. Some people hang out with Theo because he has money, but I don't. I hang out with him because he seems lonely. Then he's lucky to have you for a friend." Emma picked up the copy of Night Shift and handed it to her. "Thank you for understanding that I couldn't write what Theo asked me to." "No prob. He won't be happy about it, but at least he has an autographed book, which I took my valuable time to get for him." She lifted her coffee drink and turned back to Aiden. "Thank you so much for buying me this. If you need anything else while you're in Chicago, you have my number." "I appreciate that," Aiden said. "It's good to have contacts in an unfamiliar city. I know all the good places for music and dancing." She gave him a coy look. "I'll bet you're a good dancer." "Actually, I'm a little rusty." Emma hid a smile. Rusty indeed. He could melt an iceberg with his dance moves. "I'd be glad to help you get back into it." Terry's expression was hopeful. "It's a nice thought, but I'll be pretty busy helping Emma get through the book tour. Thanks anyway." "Okay, but let me know if you change your mind. With all those long hours, I hope she pays you well." Emma almost choked. "She does," Aiden said gravely. "Guess I'll take off." Terry didn't move. Emma decided she was supposed to be in charge, so she stood. "We have to leave too, Aiden. If you'll arrange for the car, I'll say goodbye to the bookstore manager before we leave." "I'll take care of it." Aiden all but saluted as he walked away. Terry sighed as she watched him go. "You are so lucky to have him." "I am. Gay men make the absolute best assistants." Terry's eyes rounded. "He's gay." "You couldn't tell?" "God no. My gaydar must not be working at all because I thought he was totally straight." She shook her head. "Bummer. Well, good luck with the rest of your book tour." "Thanks." Emma watched to make sure Terry left the area before she began gathering her coat, purse, and the remaining book plates. As she was wondering if she should call Aiden to check on his whereabouts, her phone chimed. When she read the text message, she laughed. Is she gone? Yes. We are at main door. Need me? She hesitated only a second while she entertained the idea of needing Aiden. She probably did need him in many ways. But she wouldn't indulge. She texted him back. No. BRT there. Sold out of books, huh? She turned. Standing about 10 feet away was a tall, angular young man. His shaggy black hair needed a trim, and his jeans and gray sweatshirt looked as if they'd been pulled from the hamper instead of a dresser drawer. A squiggle of uneasiness settled in her tummy. Yes, I'm afraid so. She still had her phone in one hand. Feeling a little foolish in case she was wrong, she tapped Aiden's number. Guess it doesn't matter. The young man approached. I met Terry coming out of the store and she showed me what you wrote. But looks like I get to meet you anyway. So you're Theo. She prayed the phone picked that up. She didn't dare take her eyes off him to check for other people around. It was late and the bookstore had mostly emptied out. Her peripheral vision told her no one was in the immediate vicinity. That's me. He smiled and his teeth looked very white and very sharp. She wondered if he'd gone so far into the fantasy that he'd filed them into points. She kept telling herself he was only a 19-year-old kid, but she hadn't factored in his height, about 6'2", or the predatory look in his dark eyes. He could be a nice-looking guy if he'd bothered with his appearance, but his careless grooming combined with those wicked-looking teeth sent shivers down her spine. He stepped closer. Did you get my emails? So you're the one who sent those? Affirmative, sweet thing. Her skin crawled, but she kept her tone polite. I'm glad you like my books. But they're pure fantasy. As we all know, there's no such thing as werewolves. Her laughter sounded about as nervous as she felt. Are you sure about that? He held up a hand, a very hairy hand. Amazing what a little spirit glue and fake hair can do, isn't it? She willed Aiden to show up now. She didn't care if he claimed to be her assistant, her fiancé, or the mayor of Chicago, just so he used his well-sculpted body to put the fear of God into this weird person who was trying to convince her he was a werewolf. This isn't fake. Theo held up his other hand, which was also covered with black hair. Give me another couple of minutes and hang on. He sniffed the air. Gotta go. Moving with astounding agility and grace, he slipped away down one of the aisles. He'd been gone about 2 seconds when Aiden arrived, panting. Missed him. Damn it. Wait here. Without asking her which way Theo had run, he turned away and scanned the various escape routes. Then damned if he didn't sniff the air. The same way Theo had before, taking off down the same aisle Theo had used to escape. Emma wondered if she'd fallen down the rabbit hole. The kid had looked somewhat unwashed, but she hadn't been able to actually smell him. Maybe Aiden was sniffing because he was coming down with a cold, so she needed to keep away from him because catching a cold in the middle of her book tour would be hell. She did as she was told, though, and waited by the signing table for him to come back. After about 10 minutes he did, but he didn't look happy. He got away. Probably had a car waiting outside, maybe even Terry's. I can't believe I missed seeing him come into the store. I'm sure there are lots of people out on the street, Aiden. He gazed at her. I just should have seen him, that's all. It's part of my job and I wasn't doing it effectively. She took a deep breath. Well, he's gone, and that could be the end of it. Hope it is. I hope so. Aiden didn't sound convinced. Give me your coat. We need to get out of here. Okay. She allowed him to help her with her coat. After dealing with Theo, she wanted to snuggle against him as he slipped it over her shoulders. I was planning to say goodbye to the bookstore manager. You can send a note. He put his hand at the small of her back and urged her forward. I'll feel better once we're locked inside the Palmer house. So will I. Theo is seriously whacked, Aiden. He's glued fake hair to the backs of his hands and I don't know if he's filed his teeth, but they look really wicked. Aiden cursed softly under his breath. Do you think we should notify the police? Emma asked as they hurried through the store. I haven't wanted to do that, but the kid may be a danger to himself and others. Well, I'm not sure what the police could do. At this point he hasn't actually threatened you, and you do, after all, write about werewolves. He could say he was just playing along the way readers of vampire books show up wearing black capes and fangs. You're right. She saw the town car and Barry standing with the back door open for her. What a welcome sight. She wanted to run forward and fling herself inside the safety of the car, but she forced herself to walk. Hello, Barry. Hello, Emma. He glanced at Aiden. Catch him. No, he got away. Damn. My thoughts exactly. Aiden climbed in after Emma. I thought about having sandwiches ready for you, but then I decided you might not want to juggle a hot pastrami on rye in downtown Chicago traffic. She buckled herself in, but her thoughts were focused on the hot pastrami and rye. Was that sandwich suggestion a lucky guess, or have you been talking to someone who knows me? Jenny might have mentioned that you liked those. Or it was in that interview I read. You must have read that interview with a highlighter. She settled back in the plush leather seat. Her conscience didn't even prick her at the luxury of. She was safe, and after the encounter with Theo, that seemed more important than class distinctions and squandering of resources. I followed your career with great interest. She turned her head to look at him. Apparently so. I still don't quite get. Though. I'm not putting down what I do, but usually it appeals to women who love the idea of an alpha male. He glanced over at her and smiled. I'll be happy to explain what I like about your books over dinner. I can call the hotel and get them started on a room service order. Do you want the hot pastrami or something else? Steak? Lobster? She thought about it and couldn't work up any enthusiasm for a big meal at this hour. It was almost 10 and she had to be up at 7. The sad thing is that with all the running, I'm not really hungry anymore. Maybe just some cheese and crackers stuffed to nibble on. Wine? Champagne? Oh, what the hell? She was in the company of a man who was so wealthy he wore an $800,000 watch. Champagne gives me a headache, but if you'll choose a really good red wine, I'd like that. I won't drink much, but I'm a little tense and that should relax me. You've got it. He tapped a number into his phone and gave some instructions to someone. She heard the name of the wine, some high-priced brand she vaguely remembered from a movie. It probably cost several $100s a bottle. She didn't want to know. It would be wonderful, as everything connected to Aiden was wonderful. When he returned to New York and she flew on to Denver, the party would be over. For now, she was still doing research. At some point she should write down the name of the wine so she could use it in a book. Aiden muted his phone. One more question, Emma. What's that? They offered to run the water in the jacuzzi for you. What do you say? She ached all over from the constant pressure of being sociable for hours. She was essentially a hermit, but a book tour required her to be on much more than she was used to. For a few seconds she thought of all that water, all that electricity needed to heat the water, and how very wasteful a jacuzzi tub was compared to a quick shower. She should really take a quick shower instead. But that wouldn't help her with her research. I say that sounds great, she said. But just to be clear, you can't join me. Don't worry. I wouldn't dream of it. He might not, but she would.